So that's not to say that you shouldn't paint like somebody. I mean, that's, I think, a requirement that you need to do to be able to learn and give yourself a baseline, and then from there you can start to deviate. But it really, just chasing the step-by-steps doesn't really help you become an artist. It doesn't really help you learn. Just find a step-by-step by an artist that you like and just keep doing that over and over and over again until it really makes sense. We're coming in here for our last session now. So we've had some break and I'm ready to lay in some of this dress. This is where it's going to get really exciting here. I'm trying to key in, I've got my color sketch up there, really trying to lock into some of the colors as nicely as I can. Dakota has revigored herself. She is reaching to the extreme right now. It would have been great to paint her like this the whole time if that were possible. But we'll see how long she's able to hold this up. I'm still needing to repaint just a little bit or readjust just a few of my shapes here. Especially now that she's giving me this extra little reach here, I can see a little bit more, paint a little bit more as the deltoid wraps around the back. So I'm going to lay some of that in there. I may adjust just a little bit more of the neck to really get it looking like it's being struck by some light. Now that she is leaning forward just a little bit more, it is catching a little more light, and I do like that lean. And if I feel like I can incorporate some of the new elements without having to repaint a lot of the old elements, I will do that. This, though, caution you, is only something you should do with a lot of experience and a lot of critical judgment, not just experience with painting, but knowledge about yourself. Like, what can you accomplish and how long would it take you to do this? And, what is your skill level at are you able to feasibly make changes like this without ruining your painting, so to speak, without running out of time. So I'm just kind of readjusting right now my attachment of the head onto the neck and shoulders. So I'll have to adjust that just a bit. And then I'm going to need to paint this ear in. I haven't painted it yet. I did not feel the ear was as important as the head or the arm or hand. But it does need to be painted in, and it needs to be painted in nice and simple, and also, again, very accurate so it doesn't look distracting.
Did you oil out a portion of the painting?
I did. I didn't use the little sponges that I normally do. I don't think I could find them at the particular time. So I just used a very, very soft paper towel that didn't give off a lot of lint. Actually, it's probably something I borrowed from James, because usually my paper towels are pretty terrible. I just used a little bit of linseed oil, some cold-pressed linseed oil, which is a higher quality linseed oil, and I just went over the flesh tone areas so that I'd be able to go and paint back in and really finish it off. Now, the way I typically do these paintings is similar to how I would work in Alla Prima, in that I'm still working section to section. Even though I may block in a whole area like I did with the arm and then carve it in, it's still the intent to finish the arm or finish the head or finish the shoulders or whatever. It's almost as how you would do a fresco painting. You map out just an area and you paint just that and you don't move on. As a result, I don't need to oil it out every day, which is good. If you oil it out every day and you don't paint on top of it, then you don't end up having any paint to kind of bind that oil to the surface, and so you get too many layers of just pure oil there. I worked each of these sections kind of independent of each other, referencing them a little bit to kind of make sure they were on track, but really just referencing the model more than anything to try and paint as accurately as I can, just isolating sections and just painting it that way. And hoping that when it's oiled out, it all comes back to the same color. And so sometimes that means I have to go and do these final touch-ups. It almost always does. I almost always have to go back around and touch up an area here or there to ensure that they all do tie together. And so, that's a harder thing about painting over multiple days. You do have to be able to paint back into an area. And so I've oiled the whole thing out, and now I'm going back in and sort of tying together the three areas, the head, the shoulders, and the arm. And then I'll be able to paint that dress in a little more accurately. Not really sure what Dakota's talking about there, but she seemed pretty excited about it. I'm also referencing my color sketch a little more and maybe adjusting my values and my colors just a bit to push it towards a more unified look altogether. It's a good time to mention the colors and the color palette that I'm using here. In case you haven't seen some of the previous videos, the system of mixing that I'm utilizing, which was introduced in the first term of the painting course, is a system of 5 sets of red and yellow and blue with this premise that any color, like a printer, can be mixed with the use of red and yellow and blue, just in different modulations. First by identifying the value of a color, that would tell you which set of red, yellow, and blue to use. Your lights, they're usually arranged in 5 value steps: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Lightest being 5. So you identify the value of a color roughly. Is it closer to a 5, a 4, 3? Then you go to that set of red, yellow, and blue. You identify the local color of the area, or the color family of the area. Is it yellow, red, blue, or maybe it's a secondary color like orange or green or purple? Then you start with that color initially, and then you just add the opposing colors until it is neutralized or adjusted or leaned more red, more yellow, or blue to appropriately look like the model. So we're always asking ourselves 3 questions. First, what is the value? Second, what is the color family? Third, what is the amount of red, yellow, and blue? Or how much does it lean? Or potentially, how neutral is it? If it's really, really neutral, more on the gray side, then that means it's equal influences of red, yellow, and blue. If it's really chromatic, really vibrant, it means you have to lean more towards one, red, yellow, or blue. So it's a really simplified way of mixing, which allows me to move very, very quickly and be able to mix back into colors very, very fast. I think it's probably the easiest method of mixing color that I've ever utilized. It can be even easier than a limited palette because you don't struggle with the loss of chroma with the addition of white, or the over blueness or over pinkness that can occur when you utilize too much white. This just really forces you to identify the value first, and that's the premise for your color selection, and then really zero in and isolate the color family, and then just modulate the chroma until it's correct. So I have on the left of my palette a really, really light yellow, red, and blue that I've actually mixed myself just with a cad yellow, a dab of cad yellow into a bunch of white, and then I have a dab of cad red into a bunch of white, and then I have a dab of some ultramarine or cobalt blue, I'm not sure, I vary, with a bunch of white. We're talking literally a dab. You just want to tint your white to be a little red, a little yellow, or a little blue. And the idea there is that you're never adding just pure white to lighten up a color. You're always thinking, well, it does need to be a light value, or it does need to go a little lighter, but doesn't need to go lighter and be more red or more yellow or more blue. And so that additional question can save you from your colors getting too chalky or too washed out. Next on the line, I've got a cad medium, or a cad lemon and a cad yellow medium right next to each other. I use one for cool light situations typically, and one for warm light situations. And then I have a cad red light next to that, and then a king's blue after that, which is a pre-mixed color that I make myself from ultramarine blue, a dab of alizarin, and some white. And I just adjust it with white to be the value that fits into that value grouping of the cad yellow, cad red lights. Next to that, I have yellow ochre, and then a cad red medium, and then a cerulean blue hue, which is somewhat like cerulean, but because it is a hue made of phthalo, it's quite a bit more intense and holds its color and vibrancy very easily when mixed with other colors. Next to that, I have a burnt sienna as my red, transparent oxide yellow as my next yellow step, and a a cobalt or usually a cobalt blue as my blue at that step, and that's a good value 2. Um, and then for my value 1, I have an alizarin as my red, a burnt umber as my yellow, and then I flip between either ultramarine blue or ivory black as my blue. And so that gives me 5 sets of red and yellow and blue. Um, and if I ever need to lean a color slightly with value, it becomes really easy that way. So if I identify, say, that the shadows in her face are going to be a mid-value, they look like they're a value 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. Then I go to my middle red, yellow, and blue, which is my yellow ochre, my cad red, and my cerulean blue hue. And when I mix those, if I were to mix those to have exact equal influences, they would be a neutral gray. They would exhibit no influence of color if done correctly. But in the case of even here, I have to identify what the color family is. So maybe it starts with a red or reddish orange. So I'd start with my cad red medium, and then I'd add my yellow ochre until I get it to be sort of the orange color that I want. And then I say, oh, well, this is too chromatic orange. I need to make it a little more neutral. And then I just add a little bit of my cerulean blue hue and in small increments, and then that neutralizes it. So I can be as gray or as chromatic as I want. If I decide, oh, well, that was pretty close, but it needs to be just a little bit lighter, well, then I switch over to the set of red, yellow, and blue that's directly lighter than that, which would be adding in a little cad red light, or a little bit of my cad yellow light, or a little bit of my king's blue, depending on whether it needs to go a little bit lighter and a little more red or more yellow and more blue. And that's the whole system of mixing that I'm going through. It allows me to work very, very quickly. Especially here, now I'm working in the background, I can lean colors really, really easily this way. I can keep things really, really blue, or just neutralize them ever so slightly. When I work in areas of really high chroma in some of these dress paintings that you'll see when I start to work on the actual dress here, or in some of the previous paintings, people have seen some of my large orange painting or large blue dress painting. Those are really, really intense chroma. Everybody always asks me, especially with the orange one, how did you paint that orange so well? Well, the key was to just stick to my red colors and occasionally add a yellow if required. So I didn't lighten it or darken it by just adding black or adding white. I lightened it and darkened it by just using reds. So if I had a color that, oh yeah, that looks great, but I need to be a little lighter, well, I added my cad red light. And then if it needed to get a little more orange, I added my cad yellow light to it also. And so that sticking to the color family just allows me to lighten or darken really, really intense colors without having any loss of intensity. And that's, I know that's a big issue for some people. They really like or want to know how to get those really intense colors, and they just can't seem to get them. Well, it's just, if you want to manipulate the value of a pure color, you only manipulate it with colors in that family. So you only, like the blues, I'm working the blues here. I'm only using my my blues and transparency at this point. So not even my king's blue, because my king's blue has white in it here. So I'm trying to shy away from that and instead use some transparencies if I want things to go lighter. So I've got my cerulean blue hue, my cobalt blue, my ultramarine blue, and I just mix those up, sometimes with a tiny bit of maybe some lemon here if I need it to get a little more of a teal color. And I can just go more transparent or more opaque to determine what the value is going to be. This is just kind of a sort of an open grisaille that I'm blocking in here, but it's really kind of an abache almost, but not really, because I'm not intending to have it as the final color. This is really just kind of a toning color, but I wanted the toning color to be sort of a neutralized blue so I can lay more intense blues on top of it. This decision is more easily made because of my color study that I've done. Here I'm trying to get a little more depth of value. I have to reference my color sketch and my and the shadows on the upper part of the dress in the model to determine how I'm going to handle the lower part of the dress here. I just want an extension of that turquoise color. So while I let that lower half set up, let some of the turp evaporate, I jump back up to the top half. Notice I'm getting these really crisp edges around her with just some opaque paint that I'm laying down. Um, those crisp edges are what's going to foil against everything I painted inside the face. You can see I did it up on the neck and the chin, and around the side of the face. I did it at the arm and actually where the dress is meeting the background. I may knock some of those down, but at least by having them right there, it immediately makes the arm, for example, stand out as more dimensional, because that edge is so crisp. And I think that's something we talked about previously before, but I think that is important because a lot of students tend to try to favor softening edges to make form turn instead of crisping up the edge to make the interior of the form work, which is, I think, a more academic idea that comes into the whole having forms or painting your figures to stand out in high relief, which is one of their guiding bullet points for figure painting. Really pushing some intense color in there right now. Just pure color. This is all just pure blues here, not diluted at all. They're just working right on top of that underpainting now. It's set up. I'm able to make marks on top of it without them mixing totally. So I'm using still kind of a small brush for the area. I mean, it's maybe an inch and a half or an inch and 3/4, but certainly bigger than anything I used in the flesh tone, and that's going to give me some bigger marks that will foil against the smaller flesh tone. On some of the larger ones, I do get into the 3-inch and 4-inch brushes. That really helps to foil against everything on the inside. And that also helps to retain that sense of scale that we talked about. So that a smaller painting here, this is only 2 feet by 4 feet, it can look kind of like it's painted the same way as one that's bigger, because the bigger ones I'm using 4-inch brushes, the smaller one maybe I get up to a 2-inch brush. Yeah, there's a 2-inch brush right there, I think. Started to block some of those flowers in the background. I'll let those set up and then I can manipulate some of the edges on them. There we go. I brushed over one. That gives me, helps me push some of them back and gets me the sense of atmosphere, actually. And this is an interesting compositional or an interesting perspective tool, I think, that I discovered a while ago, is that these flowers can be used to create atmosphere and perspective in the painting when there is none otherwise. So I'm painting a figure on a relatively shallow field, and so there isn't a whole lot of depth, but I do want to suggest depth. I want to suggest that they are in this space and that there's layers to this space. So when I paint these flowers in, I knock some of them back, either by softening or kind of a dry brush scumble over one of them, and it creates a sort of haze over them and more atmosphere, so it looks like they're pushed further back in space, and with it I get these layers of depth that foil against the sharpness and clarity of the figure that both help to make the figure stand out in contrast, but also to establish the sense of space around the figure. And sometimes I'll get the flowers flowing in front of the figure, and those I make extra sharp, and sometimes I get a palette knife out and I make them really impasto, so they actually start to look three-dimensional, almost as if they're coming out of the canvas. And then I get some of those flowers behind that are just really, really soft and pushed away. There we go with the paper towel. I think the paper towel is one of the most important tools for me to execute one of these paintings, because as I lay all these colors down, the paint starts to mush together, so the strokes get unclear, which results in a lack of understanding of detail and clarity. It doesn't make sense with the figure. And also, it gets a little too heavy and lacking in transparency. And so the paper towel works to introduce a little bit more variety and a few harder strokes sprinkled in there, just these little tiny cuts almost. And also that transparency and depth that I don't get with just opaque paint. It also works to sometimes unite areas, like you can see how I did it kind of in the dress, the back side of the dress on the bottom into the background, even in the bottom right side of the dress, how I kind of just pulled that background into the dress. So I'm working the background in and her out. Whereas if I used a brush, which is softer than my cheap paper towels that I'm using here, it could work to just soften them out. But I don't want to soften, I want to push and pull into one another. I want to dig down, expose some of that canvas, get some of the glow in there. I want my figure to look really solid and everything else to look airy. I think this is the hardest part of the painting now for me, just because everything that becomes a favorable quality about this painting for most people hinges right here, and the fabric is changing from sitting to sitting, and sometimes even within the sitting. So everything I'm looking at is just a guideline as opposed to something that I'm literally painting. And there's no right or wrong answer for how much I'm going to soften, how much I'm going to lower chroma, how much I'm going to boost chroma, how much detail I need to paint in the flowers. There's no clear guideline. So it's so much comes down to my intuition here as an artist, as a composer, as a stylist. And unfortunately, without a clear right or wrong answer, it seems like there's a lot that can go wrong. There's some freedom in that because, obviously somebody can't look at it and say, oh, well, that doesn't look right, or they might, but they usually won't because we could say our default, oh, well, it's abstract, there's no right or wrong. But I want it to feel right. And that, unfortunately, is not something that I can tell you how to accomplish in this video. I mean, you can look at examples of other work and certainly examples by painters like Richard Schmidt to see how to incorporate abstraction into reality. And that's the best guidance I can give, because other than this idea that I want her to be in focus and everything else to be out of focus, I can kind of do that by looking at her and focusing on her, and then looking at everything else out of the peripheral of my vision. That kind of helps. Working from photographs in the past kind of helps because it helps me understand this focal perspective and diffusion. But really, it's a lot of experience, a lot of master copies, a lot of alla prima paintings, really. If I didn't do alla prima painting for years and years, I would not be able to do something like this because it's those final minutes of alla prima painting that force you to do these big things that you wouldn't do otherwise. And those big things become these innocuous things that make the painting so great. When to use this brush, when to go opaque, when to cut in and become transparent. Again, that is what creates a lot of the likability of something like this. Right now, I really like, I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but I really like right now what's happening at the bottom of the canvas. So I kind of hope some of that stays through. And it can get dangerous when you're actually working on something like this, especially like an abstract painting like this, because the longer you work on it, the less it becomes an immediate impression. And I want to treat this again like the color sketch. I want the feel of this painting to be the feel that I got with the color sketch. And so that requires not too much studied painting and just sort of a gut impulse of, yeah, I like that, I leave it, this needs to be fixed, and go, go, go. I'm usually, at this point, on a lot of caffeine here, way too much caffeine to probably be healthy. Usually like a few cups of coffee or a couple energy drinks at this point, just for this last hour, couple hours, because the amount that has to go into it of focus and directness and spontaneity is huge, and because the whole painting hinges on this. And for me, unfortunately, this does become a point of stress. I think this, again, is the most stressful. I said before it's the hardest part of the painting, but I think for me it's also the most stressful part of the painting, Because if this goes wrong here, and I don't decide on it pretty much right away that it's wrong, I can't come back the next day and just scrape it off and like I did with the arm and repaint it. It loses the whole quality of the airiness and the depth and the transparency. So this has to be done with confidence and with you know commitment, because there's no going back at this point, and hopefully it all works out and I haven't wasted the last 6 sessions with the model. And so there's a lot of anxiety there, I think, associated with that.
Have you had it go wrong before? On a big scale, anyways?
No. Not, well, I mean, I've had it to where I've looked at it and been a little less excited than I hope. But there's always, it's interesting too, because there's always, of course, this little bit of mystery. So there's an excitement along with this anxiety, because I don't really know what this is going to look like in the end. A lot of it comes down to some random things. I'm sort of playing off of what's happening with the model. I'm playing off of what's happening with how some of the paint just happens to lay down there. And it's a lot of it is response based as opposed to really thoughtfulness based. So I've had situations where I've come back and I've thought, well, that didn't turn out as strongly as this, these other ones over here. That certainly happens. I don't think I've ever come back and said, oh, this is just ruined and done. But certainly, what makes or breaks a painting can happen here. And I think I like all of the ones of this series that I've done, but I certainly have some that I like more. And whether or not I like them more because of my design or color choice or how I painted it, or because of this stage of abstraction, is kind of hard to tell. So, I just give it my best shot. I've certainly had it go wrong on a small scale before, years and years of doing open studios, and trying this in an open studio and then getting home and thinking, wow, that's kind of lame, or that just really didn't work out. And then maybe trying to work it at home, maybe just abandoning it completely. But luckily, I've had hundreds and hundreds of attempts under my belt before I even attempted something large like this. And I almost never attempt something large like this without a color study. Because if it doesn't go right in the color study, if I'm not enamored by the color study, if I don't look at the color study and say, oh my gosh, this is going to be awesome, then I won't even attempt the big one. I'll just redo the color study or change my idea completely. Also trying to keep in mind this idea that she is supposed to be emerging kind of out of a water kind of scene, and so this should start to look like some splash or force coming out of it, around and behind her, to give it that idea. So I have pushed that background quite a bit more blue than I see. I don't think there's any relevant point to actually painting it the way it was. I do want to key it to her and key it to the idea. One of the things this painting is largely about is this color. This is the color that I want. I spent a long time thinking about and planning around this idea of this color. This was the color that I wanted to use. And one of the reasons I used Dakota was because her skin looked so nice against this color.
How did you decide on this color?
It's one that I've liked before and seen before. It's one that's popped up before. And when I saw the color, I really, really liked it. And I think this was, at least at one point, the Pantone color of the year. And so now I'm actually, within the past year, I'm seeing it everywhere. In even some of the bigger box commercial stores, going in and seeing just pillows and comforters and kitchen pot sets that are all this color. But it's mostly because I liked it. I always have to start these paintings with this idea, especially the big ones, that there's a possibility that it might not sell. You know, the gallery might not have space for something like this. It may end up be sitting in my studio for a while. So the main reason for me painting it has to be I want to look at it and I want to hang it up in my studio.
Does that make it difficult when you sell them and you have to let them go into the world?
Yeah, sometimes it does. So some of them I'll actually become so attached to that I'll just not sell them. But yeah, sometimes you have to let them go, unfortunately. I started painting with this idea that I wanted to keep as many of my paintings as I could, which I still kind of have that idea. But I do understand, you know, I have an obligation to the gallery, and I think it's important to be involved with that and important to sell paintings. So I try to limit the ones that I have to keep. And for the most part, I show the gallery almost everything that I have. There's just a couple pieces a year that I become so attached to that I don't want to let go. I'm painting in here with a brush with a lot of mineral spirits in it, and that's how I cut out some of those lighter accents down there. It's actually not paint on the bottom. That's a brush that I just stripped away with some mineral spirits. And that gives a harder, crisper edge down there than it would with just white paint, and the color stays more intense and chromatic down there also. Got a really big brush here that I'm even doing some dry brushing with, introducing some layered texture into the lower half. I'm going to try and use the canvas and the canvas tone to show through in the end. I want gaps and patches. You can see some of that in the top left corner there, where there's this subtle variety that almost looks like a dry brush, and that's just with under toning showing through. I want to try and leave some of that if I can. I'm going into her hair. Again, I'm just loosely kind of looking at the color, really more keying the color, kind of from that, but mostly from the dress. Keeping most of my paint a little thicker up there, a little thinner as it gets towards the side, and then I'll soften some edges out as I need to, just to get them a little more wispy and, you know, keep them abstract. At this size and this scale, they don't need much to read as flowers. You know, there's very few things that somebody would put in their hair like this in this kind of context, and so I can use that that idea to be able to limit the amount of detail that I have to paint, and that's something important to consider too. You know, if there's only a certain few situations where something pops up and somebody will look at it and obviously assume that it is something because of the context, then that means you can paint a little more loosely. Back here, I am trying to get as loose as I can, just sort of devil-may-care with some of these strokes, laying in much thicker paint, trying to get some variety in there, and then I'll swoop and soften and flick some edges out to create some of that depth. I usually paint the flowers in 3 stages. The first stage is sort of just a basic sort of mid-value, mid-color tone for them. Then I'll go in with some of the darks with some medium in there to keep them more transparent and a little richer. And then I'll throw on top some more impasto highlights. And depending on how close the flower is to the figure in the painting versus how far back or advanced forward it is, will determine how many little values and colors I put in there. So one that's right close to the figure, I'll have my full range of 3 values at least. And then as it gets a little further away, they get reduced to just 2 value flowers and flower petals. And then as it gets further away, the flower petals become 1 value flower petals. And that is an idea of atmospheric perspective to introduce different depths and layers to the painting. I will always try to put some flowers behind the model or in the model's hair when I'm doing this. So I'm not totally making it up. I actually typically have a really hard time doing that if I don't have something to go off of. I'm much more comfortable with observing and abstracting what I see and fitting what I see into an idea rather than completely coming up with something out of my head, which I could probably do, but it definitely wouldn't be as strong. It's certainly what I did with the color sketch a lot more. But I don't feel that I knew enough about what I'm painting to go from the color sketch to a full-size painting and introduce all this detail. So I really want to be influenced more by what I see. And this is probably because for so many years at the Palette and Chisel, I was given a setup and I had to make a painting work out of that. So that skill grew and grew. I did add in some tiny little red dots throughout, just to make it a little bit more interesting and have a little more color variety in some areas that would otherwise I feel be too monochrome. Those little accents of red will help push the viewer's eye subtly throughout the painting. Just tiny little compositional thoughts. And now I'm done with the model, so I'm just trying to figure out last little accents, last little touches. Really create, treat this as a work of art instead of just trying to copy the model. And just try to see if there's any edges that stand out, any colors that stand out, any areas where I need to push things further back or pull things further forward. And that's it.